Hello, I'm Stephen Matchett, and this is Expert Opinion from Future Campus, where we ask higher education people who know what's going on. What's going on? The Quilt Student Opinion Survey results are just out, but while they're pretty much the best local metrics on higher ed performance we have, Uncle Calderon and Hamish Coates argue they need replacing. They warn the Quilt data is, and I quote, dated, error-riddled, hardly spurs a policy murmur, and fails to ignite educational social change. And so they propose 9 new ways to measure how higher education institutions can serve students and engage with communities. Uncle Calderon is a global higher education specialist with 30 years of experience in expertise in strategy and planning and performance measurement. Hamish Coates is a higher education researcher with a range of prestigious present appointments, including as editor for the Society for Research into Higher Education, and they both join me now. Hamish Coates, can I start by asking why Quilt no longer cuts it?
Thank you, Stephen, and thanks for the opportunity to have a conversation about the most important thing in higher education, that is how we help students learn, graduate them, and fuel the world with so many excellent brains. When I started to design the architecture for the thing that became Quilt, including the thing that became Quilt, it was innovative, marvellous, required a lot of courage, some acumen, and a lot of excellent conversations with senior people, not just in Australia, but all around the world. Australian higher education was really innovative. We came up with great ideas about student experience. I leant over and had some dialogue with my leading US colleagues, and we introduced the word student engagement and built a data collection to underpin that in Australia, New Zealand, and eventually in about 25 to 35 countries around the world and growing. We came up with concepts that pushed us to think that higher education was more than just a teacher delivering a lecture to seats full or empty of students with pens full or empty and papers with notes or otherwise, to something that was much more about how higher education had moved into the centre of not just the economy, but to our thinking about how humans prosper in the world. And that's really where higher education's gone over the last 20 years, where the metrics that I developed principally between about 2002 and 2012 have taken us. But I have to say by 2024 and now on the doorstep of 2025, we are now seeing a dilapidating data set. It is no longer fit for the excellent system that Australia has in higher education. It is no longer using the sharpest technology. I started by using paper-based surveys, and we had to lick the envelopes and put them all in the mail at an Australia Post office. Well, Australia Post is reformed, higher education is reformed, but we're still doing reasonably mundane survey data collections, whereas higher education institutions are full of the most amazing tech these days. The actual things that we've been asked to measure these days to keep ourselves ahead of the jump, and I mean in the hour there, not just higher education, but Australia and innovative higher education systems, they're the things that I was thinking of 25 years ago. And of course, what that always means is what we measure determines what we talk about, determines what we do. And so we're no longer doing the innovative things. So what we've been thinking about is how we take forward our thinking beyond my thinking 25 years ago to try and make sure that higher education in Australia in 25 years is much further down the track. It has that innovative, charismatic, courageous spirit that it certainly did when I came into designing data collections in Australian higher education. So as the architect of Quilt, I think I have the right to say it's time to take stock and to move on. And if you look at the sort of questions that are asked in the data collection, again, literally things that I wrote on a sheet of paper in 2002, they're not the things that we now know matter to students. And these are the students now being born today who are going to graduate in 25 years. They're not the things that matter to those people or their communities or their professions. At the same time, the data we collect, we now know about 20% of students think about dropping out. And I think, Stephen, we had a conversation about this back in 2007. So the question is, why haven't we got that down to zero? Or how are we going to ask new questions to try and understand how to get that down to zero? The Quilt data collection is an Australian special. It's not collected to schools. It's not collected to vocational higher education. It's not collected to the 35, 40 countries I mentioned before. And still, we have one of the most globally porous higher education systems, but our data collection on the student side is incredibly parochial and isolated. We've got to do more than that, because unless we keep putting education on the map, the prestige draw of research metrics will always suck the energy of the university executives, the aspirant academics, and indeed the students who are fundamentally making purchasing decisions about higher education. We need to have excellent data about the quality of education and the value it contributes. And that's exactly where Angel and I have been doing some thinking in the Higher Education Futures Lab.
You've written extensively about the need for performance metric rankings that go way beyond traditional research and teaching. I think you've talked about the importance of including some of the UN performance measures. Where does that sort of thinking sit in a proposed new model?
This is part of the thinking Hamish and I have been doing for some time, and it's embedding lots of different data sets universities have and going beyond just the typical things in there, but also trying to integrate all the different elements that universities do and the activities, and keeping the student at the heart of the university activity, because in part, lots of the things are really there. We are really collecting the data, but not really integrating and utilizing the data, and also the other gaps in the data that we have been thinking about, that we are being able to identify. But also importantly, we also need to get to a point where we are able to make decisions a lot sooner and be able to integrate the data and to respond more promptly to what the students are telling us. Like all the cycle that we have had for many years about the student feedback and closing the loop, we are no longer doing that, pretty much because we have been driven by a set of limited measures that basically have been driving the thinking rather than trying to say in which ways we are fulfilling the student needs and experience, and how in which ways we can better service those students and fulfill the institutional mission. And the other thing about that is how we integrate the student experience, the institution, and also with the external world, right? And that is where the UN mission or statements about global development and so forth fit in, because we're all connected to each other. So what happens in the institution happens in society. And basically, when the students come to university, basically resemble what's occurring in society. So there are lots of things we really want to be untangling, but also we need to be able to make decisions and inform what's actually going to be happening a lot sooner. Just getting the data, a year or 2 years down the track is too late. We really have to get the cycle back to the point where we are able to be responding to the student feedback a lot sooner.
Hamish, who, if anyone, on a national level is doing it better than we are now?
Well, I think what we're seeing happening is that the higher education systems, and I talk about systems because a lot of the big countries have many different higher education systems inside them, the US being the principal one, but there are many others, are innovating that have come up in the last couple of years. So, East Asia would be my short answer. And if you think about the East Asian systems that are innovating, Singapore, South Korea, certain major cities on the East Coast of China, and of course, you only have to look to Indonesia to see a higher education system that's fundamentally private in nature, and as a result, has really spurred into action in terms of thinking about how they can start to carve out new forms of value creation for the communities that they're serving. Deeply interlinked in global thinking, with the UN and all that involves, deeply interlinked in the ASEAN society with all the billions of people that are embraced by that, and of course, an upcoming and thriving higher education system. Some of it they're immature, some of it still bricks and mortar stage, and of course you'd put China 15 to 20 years down the track. So when you do look around the world, you start to see systems, major systems, that weren't there when I started to design this stuff with my Anglo-Euro-American mates. These are new higher education systems that have come onto the block. And interestingly, very recently, we start to see new activity in Europe, because Europe compared to the Anglo-American systems and the Asian systems, has integrated itself to a certain extent with all of the EU harmonisation work, but haven't really been able to cut through. And we have to, at this stage, I'm afraid, use the word global rankings. Now, people in Australia think they are the bee's knees, but actually when you get into much bigger systems, they matter far less. And what does matter is understanding whether the government's spending money, the universities are spending money in ways that are generating education value, whether students are prospering. I just gave a talk in Pakistan 2 weeks ago, and they were telling me, yes, they have a huge problem with academic integrity. And yes, they need to start having public conversations about that so that they can bring that out of the closet and make sure that the students are learning properly. And if you look at the Pakistani higher education system, doesn't rate compared to Australia's in terms of research output, but enormously valuable in terms of the curation of professional talent, not just for Pakistan, but for the world. So, you know, this is the broader agenda here, to look at these systems that have come up in the last 20 years. And of course, the US continues to innovate. There are fantastic pockets of innovation there. And to look at what is happening in terms of those frontiers being pushed forward in the field of higher education, innovation and development. You know, if I hadn't have done that innovation 25 years ago, we'd still be measuring student satisfaction. My big agenda then was to kill student satisfaction and bring to life conversations about student engagement. I would say the big agenda now is to have conversations about community value and co-creation and sustainability and how we take forward the returns from education to make sure that governments don't think it's a waste of money. Now, people like us tend to like higher education, but there are obviously those out there, some in huge positions of power, who just don't see that it's a good investment either of government or of household money, and that's a problem. So we do need to look to these lifelong systems and think, how can we glean insights about how they are demonstrating the return and the value of higher education and bring those conversations to life in the Australian community?
So what you're talking, if I've got this right, what you're talking about is metrics that don't just reflect existing performance, but point directions for strategic development.
Yeah. So if I think about the data that swirls around universities, and you know, in the late 1990s, a lot of that was paper-based, and we had some emerging enterprise systems. You know, if the president, and I just saw a display of this at the Tsinghua Higher Education Forum 1 month ago, if the president of any university, and I'm guessing this applies in Australia as well, wants to know exactly what's happening at a particular library in a particular campus, they can pretty much get that data in real time. So as Angel said, we really don't need 2-year out data to be able to drive that executive decision making and planning at this stage. But what we do need is we need information that encourages conversations about new forms of thriving for universities. There is much more to universities than tech, consultants, 24-hour media cycles, you know, international education revenue. They are all in a way means to create the value of education. And unless we put some words around what we're trying to do, and we've done a lot of that in the last 30 years of international expansion, but unless we continue to carve out new forms of value, we start to calcify and atrophy. And if we do that, you know, universities won't thrive and the students and faculty within them won't thrive. And that's a pity, because Australia, if I can speak nationally for a little moment, has always been very innovative in that regard. And we need to make sure we're on the front step.
And so you've come up with, from memory, 9 metrics that you propose should be the basis of that. Angel, what are they? What are the 9 you propose?
Can I take a step back before we get into the 9 metrics? Because one thing that perhaps is important to keep in mind is the following, and it's joining the different dots in the different data sets that we have, or the different things universities do, and also taking a more external lens as to what are the things that the universities are doing in-house and how that resonates externally, and also bringing all those sorts of things. So it's almost like joining the dots internally, but also what is the outward impact that the things that we do, and how are the different bits that we join between our capabilities, the partnerships, and how we are able to start measuring the successes of the different things that we're doing. So probably if we want to talk about the 9 metrics, Hamish, what about if we just pair a bit more on the 9 different metrics?
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, the first one very much is whether or not students have got an opportunity to learn at university. And of course, students, we've traditionally thought in terms of the equity indicators in Australia of domestic students from poor or particular demographic backgrounds. It's a much bigger issue than that. And the online learning movement has shown us that the people who have lost their jobs at the age of 55 have the opportunity to reskill. That's really important as well. So do universities and their partners create learning opportunities? Second, and I think this is something that's always been under the hood for the last 20 years, who are those partners? Who is actually delivering higher education services? We discovered that a very large proportion of public education is in fact delivered by private institutions in the Anglosphere. So in the US, Australia, and the UK, for example, but also in other parts of the world. So what are those partnerships that are actually delivering public education? I think that's something that many don't know about, but we need some more transparency about that so we can make sure that they're actually creating value for the communities that surround higher education. We know very little about education investments. You know, the global rankings are silent on money. How universities choose to invest in education is something that we have investigated across 15 Asian countries, but still in Australia, great big black hole. We simply don't know. University councils might, the executives might, but even there, we know they often don't know. We don't know how people make investments. So it's the kind of investments that universities make. In terms of partnership, are they encouraging partnerships that are building resilience in communities? We talk about that in Australia when we have disasters, you know, bushfires or the like, but are they actually building broader forms of economic and social resilience? That's a huge part of community, and it goes well outside the walls of the university. Are they positioning their resources in ways that are actually going to contribute value? And we see that happening with some federal policy around study hubs, but it's actually much a bigger thing than that. Are universities putting themselves out there to be resources that the community can use? The sixth one, I guess, is really important. There are some estimates that 30% of students in this country, and probably all around the world, Australia is not going to be special in this regard, are cheating. Can I use that simple word? They're either cheating by omission, using some sort of tech device, or they're cheating by commission. And there's a lot of that goes on through purchasing academic services and also through subtle forms of collaboration. So we need to have much more surfaced conversations to be sure that when someone graduates, they actually know what we are saying they know. Because we're going to have some sort of compounding problem if whole waves of graduates come out of universities and we say they can build a bridge, structurally sound, and they can't. We need much better national conversations about academic integrity. And I have to say, the Australian higher education regulator has actually been leading some global discussions on that front, which is good to see. But they're very complicated and they're new dialogues, and we need some simple metrics. So we've actually got them under the hood. Are we working with communities to co-create social value? Australia and colleagues around the world have done enormous work on that. Do universities send their students out to do work integrated learning, professional placements during their summer break? Do they go out and help impoverished communities? There are many countries that is an absolute plank of the higher education experience. Not so in Australia. Do the staff go out and do voluntary community service so that they can be sure that they are part of the communities and understanding the communities beyond preparing publications for index journals? Are the returns from education any good? And we have a lot of economists that argue about this concept, but fundamentally, if you go to the pizza restaurants, the pubs, and the water parks of Australia, you will see conversations that people can't answer because the universities have spent too much time squabbling amongst themselves and with government about economic finery. We need some pretty broad-brush statistics, and the US has been doing this for about 15 years, about whether university education is worth the cost, time, and effort. And fundamentally, after all of that, we need information about academic value. Does the academic enterprise itself contribute insights and value to the community? Does it help flourish new professions, carve out new startups, and add to the broader economy? You know, Australia has a very resources service sector economy. Where are all those other parts of our economy that so many flourishing economies have in the Asian region? And how do we carve out new people into those? We've seen some discussion about the shortfall on math skills related to upcoming defence investments and others. So what are we doing as universities to make sure that we're making financially short-term difficult decisions to invest in something that Pythagoras told us so many years ago is fundamentally important to human flourishing? So academic value is the final indicator.
So you can see there are so many different elements that in many ways universities will have some data, partial data, or no data at all, or whether we are not joining the dots. And sort of basically what Hamish was describing to those 9 elements was basically things that, as Hamish was saying, oh, we have something on this, or we have nothing on that. So there are different things in here that potentially we have some data, we don't have it, or things where we need to be strengthening, but it's a way to start having the conversations as to how we are able to start shaping a new way of doing things in universities will help us to face the challenges that we have right now and prepare us to be better institutions and better for the students in the future, in the years to come.
So what you're talking about is potentially a template which institutions can slot their data, their existing data into?
We've got a little bit more than a template. In fact, the 9 measures have all been proven in about 20 countries and are alive and well in many countries. And down the track, if we have time to take a breath in and makes writing further contributions to try and shake further conversations out of the Australian higher education sector, we will actually populate these metrics. We did that quite a bit 5-10 years ago to try and show how, you know, Australia is not just one single university. It is in fact a plurality of cosmopolitan university experiences and systems, now quite mature in certain respects, but in other respects, dwindling, in other respects, very immature. Let's not think that we are at the front of the pack in all regards. We're certainly not. So we will start to populate some of these things with the proven metrics. Like I mentioned, the one about education returns, proven through an Asian Productivity Organisation project spanning 7 years with about 12 countries all across Asia. So we have knowledge about what needs to be plugged into that, and also how these indicators will drive new thinking in higher education. It is not all about international student revenue. It is not all about rankings. It is not all, as we have endeavoured to point out, about student engagement metrics invented 25 years ago. We have powerful new insights that universities, whether they like it or not, because fundamentally Australia is a beautiful big country, but it has a very small higher education in the scheme of the globe, will have to come to terms with to accelerate their performance.
To take as an example, the stuff that Hamish was just describing, what you're talking about, that makes me think about that we need better information about our teachers and the teaching practice. So it's a starting point. We don't have much about who our teachers are, and our teaching, our discussion with Hamish, we say, well, you know, in the universities, we have teachers who are basically being professional students for years because they finished their undergrad, went to PhD, and stay on. They don't have experience as a student. People want to see that the teacher relates to them, has experience in the field industry. So we need to be collecting more data about our teachers and also how they're working, because that will get our students more connected with our teachers to be able to do more things. So, you know, this is just an example where we need to be able to start gathering better data. And also, Hamish was talking about the work integrated learning. Universities doing phenomenal work on that space, but we're not really utilizing the data effectively to navigate the students to be able to say, I got the skills that will help me to face the future, because not everyone wants to have a job straight away. Everyone wants to have different experience, but be able to be assured that those students have experience working with industry or having experience in working in the field they are passionate about, and that when they finish their studies, they feel they accomplished something. So there's lots of different things universities could be doing a lot better in a more organized way that to help us to respond to the student needs.
Why with marketing this, you could make a case that it could be entirely a standalone product that universities adopt by themselves. That there's no necessary need for institution X to be compared against institution Y on this. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's a fair point. And I think the reason we adopted rankings and benchmarks because we want to feel that, we're better than someone else.
Yeah.
That's the things, for years of working in higher education, not many people are now interested in doing benchmarking because it leads to nowhere. If people want to be able to say we rank here or there, we are above someone else because people want to promote that as a success. So we need to have the level of evaluation, self-assessment, and things like that, but also ways where we need to have something that gives us a roadmap for improvement and to develop things that will help institutions. Because at the end of the day, universities are here to be enablers for society and to be, generally good citizens.
So what do you want to happen now? I mean, you've got product that is you've a product that is can be deployed. So who's going to deploy it? Who's going to organize it? What do you want to happen?
Yeah, there are, and this proposal sits in amongst many others as part of the Higher Education Futures Lab, Stephen. So there are probably two main outcomes as next steps. The first one is to help Australia have active dialogue about its future higher education institutions and systems and all of the education special bits that it produces, research included. It needs to have more of that discussion. Australia has built a higher education system beautifully, maybe, after the turn of the century for about 12, 15 years, which really for the last 10 years has now been serviced by consultants and lawyers and all those wonderful people who help optimize within the current system. But are we still doing, this is a serious question for the country, are we still doing the extent of innovation that we should be doing to keep the whole system moving and growing in new and genuinely different ways? So genuine dialogue and questions is the main point of the Higher Education Futures Lab, within which we have launched this discussion, because there didn't seem to be another platform in Australia to do that. There are in other countries, but within Australia, there certainly didn't. So that's the first thing, having dialogue about the future of Australian higher education that's not within the constraints of the current TEXA Act or, stakeholders' perceptions of what we should do. The second thing is very much to build data sets and innovate data sets that give life to higher education. When you first do it, of course, there's a change curve and people resist it and there's some early adopters and all the usual stuff. Once people embrace it, you find all sorts of things happen. Student engagement, I remember, Latrobe started a whole section on student engagement, a whole new workforce started up. We started to talk about how students were engaging, not just whether they were happy or sad within the student satisfaction rhetoric. So that's really the next step in this data process, to try and change the conversation and have discussion. Angel just mentioned, universities are doing all of this stuff. We're not proposing new investment or new work. There's no new money required for any of this, but there is some value in organising the thinking in ways that are proven by research, not just by good ideas, but proven by research, so that people can have evidence-informed conversations. I mean, billion-dollar institutions need good data, and it's really to try and inject some fresh thinking into the dialogues about running those institutions that we seek as the second next step.
Without the Commonwealth imposing, I very much doubt Quilt would have ever have happened. How are you going to convince institutions that would just prefer you to go away, that they really should start talking to each other about this?
Yeah, so actually, interesting analysis, partly true, partly untrue. The Australasian University Student Engagement Survey, which I developed from 2002 to 2011-12, became population level in Australia and New Zealand. And through the OECD, I took it to, like I said, 25 other countries. And it was already existing in some of the world's biggest higher education systems, principally China and the US, where it came from, and Canada and Mexico. So, we already had that flourishing data set. The government in Australia stepped in to institutionalise it, and it is now used for risk monitoring in a regulatory sense. It is used for some institutional marketing, which is great. But there's more sort of institutional marketing in higher education. So, what are the extra dividends that it's creating? Well, it's now almost certainly a compliance tool. And as a result, it's not generating that active engagement. When I launched the Australasian Survey of Student Engagement, we started out with one institution, with two, and like I said, after 3 or 4 years, we had 50 or 60. So if it's a good idea and it creates value, people love doing stuff. And it's great when things get institutionalized because, yeah, without the government, it wouldn't have had the continuity to now being run annually, but it shouldn't be run annually. Like when I was analysing the CEQ back 20 years ago, the results don't change every year, surprise, surprise. We need new and fresh thinking. So it may well be that the government does step in, and I always found the Australian government very entrepreneurial when it comes to higher education. That's how we've ended up where we are.
And I think often we see change happens progressively as well. You know, change doesn't happen overnight, and institutions do not replace a set of instruments so quickly. And I think, you know, you just mentioned, Hamish, about the CEQ. I was using the CEQ GDS for years before the introduction of the SES surveys and other instruments that universities have been using, and it generated lots of discussions. And I think this year we have been trying to, you know, have lots of discussions about what's actually happening in terms of higher education through global rankings and performance measurement and so forth, but also try to refresh the thinking that we need to have a better set of data that will help us to make better informed decisions about the direction and the future of Australian higher education, but also just not relying on a set of metrics that over the years, you know, have led us to just a particular lens of view of the world where, you know, we have been missing lots of the data or lots of things happening about the student experience, the student life, and we need to make sure that we embed that into our thinking and decision making more seriously.
I admire the optimism. I just wonder how you'll go in the short term, at least, in convincing a lot of institutions to take it on.
Yeah, I think it's the other way around, actually, because all of the precursor work that's underpinned the 9 indicators that we're proposing has been developed by universities itself. So if I can take the academic integrity one, for example, like I mentioned, Australia's been forerunner here. The government's heavily involved. It's got an academic integrity unit in its higher education regulator, which is pretty unusual globally. And all of the university leaders know well it's a problem. So they are looking for solutions as to how they can have management information to try and understand this institutional issue that they are confronted with. If you look at the issue around community co-creation, they know that they're investing in community. They know that they have invested money in those community projects, but they also know that that value isn't being recognised. And we've seen this in the latest round of federal university relations. That value isn't being recognised by the politicians, certainly, and perhaps also by the broader community. So some way that helps them sell that, as is now the term de rigueur, social licence, is going to be increasingly important. The universities, of course, have baked in the conversation about how they invest in education and how they're creating education returns. They have been part of those conversations all along. So to your point, who invests in innovation in Australian higher education? Well, in my mind, it's usually been a great partnership between universities and between government. And there are usually some other players in that, but invariably it's between universities and government. And the dialogue between universities and government has become very focused on a small number of matters in this country, obviously to do with some governmental policy reforms. But there is much more to universities than that. And as so many universities look to new forms of academic service delivery, and I'm talking about teachers and how we employ teachers and promote teachers, they're going to have to think in new and different ways. And they all know that. We're in conversation with so many university leaders about how we take forward new conversations about higher education in Australia. And another thing that they know, of course, is Australia has thrived in higher education, had enormous and probably oversized global impact. But unless we keep innovating and growing, like I mentioned, there are some pretty big higher education systems on our doorstep who will very quickly, and in many respects already have, leapfrogged us in terms of power and influence. So we do need to keep the conversations moving. We can't keep optimising within 20-year-old constraints.
And I think the current policy settings and the current climate that we have here in Australia right now provides us with the vehicle to innovate more. I mean, it's the time of that crisis or times of facing challenges that, prompts us to start thinking better ways in which we can do things, and basically provides us with the vehicle to innovate and to put us in the next, in the best step for the next 25 years.
So is it a question of just putting the model out there and inviting people to take it up, or is there more to do in aggressively encouraging them?
Yeah, so there's one works in a variety of ways to get innovation in higher education. And I've got to say, it's probably one of the most difficult sectors to innovate within, because universities are institutionally conservative by nature, but they're also incredibly innovative within their shells. And you do have to find, of course, those early adopters, and you have to find the people who think it's a terrible idea and you're going to kill higher education and the sky's going to fall in. And you have to work with all of those people. And I suppose it's not just us. I mean, we're kicking some of these ideas off, but there are many hundreds, if not thousands, of people behind all of these 9 indicators. And there's a broader dialogue, like I mentioned. So let me just say a little bit about the Higher Education Futures Lab. I mean, we proposed the 9 indicators here. Last week, we proposed a whole series of community engagement indicators, many of which are linked with the UN SDGs, and whether Australia gets with that program or not, or institutionally does.
Explain the acronym.
The UN SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals.
Okay, the UN ones.
Yeah. The UN indicators.
Yes.
Yeah, so that's not correct. So that in Australia, that's not yet a household name, but there are many higher education systems where it is an acronym that's used, just like the rankings are used as an acronym in Australia. Many countries have the UN SDGs as an acronym. And there are a much broader suite of expectations about how universities deliver, not just for the local graduate employer, but for the planet and the solar system even, So there are whole ways of framing higher education that huge higher education systems have positioned themselves to respond to. So there's the academic integrity piece. We're also doing more work on questioning the value of technology. There's billions and billions and billions of dollars goes into technology, and yet we know the best form of education often happens in a room with just a teacher and students. So, what are we doing to have those conversations? It's not all great. How do we actually establish the educational, not just the financial or cyber value of EdTech? That's a conversation that Australia hasn't had as much as many of the world's biggest higher education systems. We see conversations going on in the US, through to Europe, through to Asia. Australia's not even having those conversations, and yet we've pretty much sold all of teaching and learning onto platforms. Who's now having that discourse in this country? And not very popular, but a really important conversation to have. What does the future of the teaching workforce look like? Why do our best and brightest perhaps not want to work as university academics? Do we even know if that's the case? We have a sneaking suspicion, and we have some data it's not the case. Well, how do we turn that around? And how do we get people wanting to work inside higher education, not in other sectors of the economy? They're all the sorts of reasonably 3 to 6 month, as opposed to 3 to 6 hour conversations that we're hoping to launch. So there are a broader series of dialogues and debates that we have. And as you point out, not everyone's going to like that degree of questioning. There is a bought-in nature to higher education, but by its very nature, unless we keep shaking the trees and innovating, we become sclerotic. And if we become sclerotic, the bones tighten and the leaves shed, we don't have the infrastructure to try and help students learn.
An evolutionary process. That was a question.
In my experience, and I've launched about 50, starting a new data collection in higher education tends to take about 3 to 6 months. If you actually look at the advent of the Shanghai ranking, which of course happened by accident and then took over the world before it was emulated by other ranking systems, it started through conversations exactly like this one. If you actually talk with our colleagues in Shanghai who developed the thinking to help China understand how it could make sense of its development relative to other higher education systems, nothing to do with rankings, they developed some ideas and they developed some statistics, They tinkered with those. They got more people involved. And just like laughter, you know, if one person does it, the next person does it, you tend to find good ideas catch on. Student engagement's a good example. You pretty much can't say you're not interested in student engagement. You have to have some degree of investment in how students engage. And then the next question is, well, how do you know if the students use the library at all? And I say, well, we don't. Well, okay, well, let's get some data. So there's a natural process of talking about how we can make education better.
I think one of the biggest challenges often institutions face is the ability to make a move or change into things, because often the data we have is about the decision making and the execution. And hopefully, you know, this kind of dialogue and platforms provide an opportunity for people, for institutions and leaders to equip them with the tools to act.
But you're going to have to keep it front of mind. That's going to take a lot of work.
Yeah, that's right. So, you know, in the way we communicate in higher education has changed as well. I mean, of course, we used to do it in a room, and then we all of a sudden did it online during the pandemic. And then even those online platforms have sent their staff back to the offices. So it is really a multimodal sort of thing. Australia's a reasonably small system. I mean, let's put this into perspective. To get the whole of the US system or the whole of the Indian system or the whole of the Chinese system in one room is very much impossible. In Australia, you can actually do that. You can have dialogues with, you know, the people who are thinking about these forward-looking ideas reasonably easily. And of course, you can do that in Europe, but even there, Europe's much more complicated and big. So there is an opportunity to get those dialogues moving. These ideas won't be the ones that go forward. It's a matter of being humble and saying, let's be intellectually open and think forward. Being really deterministic about how that forward thinking is going to happen, of course, is contrary to the purpose. So it's a matter of then starting new dialogues. And when those new dialogues start, that's when you've changed this talk and start to change the action. Then you see universities like Angel said start to change the data, and that takes a period of process to work into the systems. But you do need that, you know, change momentum happening.
So who are you going to convince first? The institutional lobbies, the teaching and learning community, the deans groups?
Oh, it will be a combination of different people and actors that will come into the equation. Because if you think that if we say, oh, will be who on this kind of group, we might be mistaken, because it might be someone else completely different. I think just by being open about, there's no particular set of criteria or agenda or particular group in there, but it's the whole sector that needs to embrace and travel with us in the journey. That is what is important, because I think, you know, as Hamish was describing, things keep moving along. And I think everyone is interested in getting to know better and to be able to act on the stuff, on the student engagement. It's just about how we navigate the conversation and get everyone along the journey. And then things will start happening, you know. We're taking a step in here to the dialogue, and potentially there will be others who will be coming in, other actors, and creating the agency to generate the change.
Where do you want to be with this in a year?
Oh, I think very much you want to have a national dialogue. I said there's two planned outcomes. So the first one is to have broader, thriving conversations about the future of higher education. That's why the Higher Education Futures Lab has been launched. And very much so, I think, having much more people participating in those dialogues than is currently the case, which is, you know, it has really shrunk in Australia over the last 20 years. And we're really resting on the laurels.
When you say it's shrunk over the last 20 years, tell me more.
Australia used to be a very innovative higher education system, and we sort of set up the architecture. And if you look at higher education funding, if you look at higher education regulation, the data piece that we've just talked about, if you look at how we train academic staff, you know, we have got much bigger in terms of a system, but we haven't necessarily become more innovative in how we've gone about thinking about stuff. And look, back to your early question about change drivers, if Australia, which is fundamentally a reasonably isolated higher education system geographically, looks at the rest of the world and sees what's happening, often doesn't have too much of a choice, because we really want to be in that global game, and we are. So, you know, the change forces internationally are often the ones that drive change here. And I'll give you a simple example. I took forward the OECD project in engineering and economics with 30 countries in 2010, 11, 12. In 2012, the entire Australian medical dean set said, let's work together, including with aspects of the UK, Malaysia and New Zealand, who have reasonably aligned medical systems, as I'm led to understand. And we developed the Australian Medical Assessment Collaboration, which was far more extensive. We couldn't have guessed that a year ahead of time, that we would then run the biggest medical assessment in Australian higher education ever. So, you know, some of these things, you just launch the conversation and things kick off, but very much in a year's time, much more innovative conversations about higher education change in this country. And I mean in public. And that involves a certain amount of putting the commercial and confidence stuff that universities have grown to specialise in, if you look at council minutes and all sorts of consultancy arrangements, putting that in the bottom drawer and having open conversations about aspirations and anxieties and potential ways forward. And you can't really ever do this within a single institution. You know, in the journals that I publish, and there's two, and of course I've been involved in many more, as soon as you get something that's a single institution, you say, important piece of institutional research for that institution, and it could be a Monash that's Goliath, but still it's not going to scale to the one next door or the one in a different country. You really do need interinstitutional conversations. Some of that's already happening, of course, so it's a matter of taking that forward. The second thing in regards to the data in particular, I think it's highly feasible that within 3 to 6 months we could have a prototype up, which will poke some anxieties, some aspirations, annoyances, and also some further work and development to try and show the value that these new conversations can yield for universities.
What sort of support, if any, do you need to do that in 6 months?
I started the Australasian Survey of Student Engagement and the Hello process on a Sunday afternoon, sitting in my dining room. So the support you need is to have the conviction of the power of ideas. Yeah, and I would say one thing about Australian higher education in the last 20 years, and there are all sorts of quotes about this, but as soon as money comes into the equation, are you really doing higher education or are you doing commerce? And I think it's really important to just say, right, there are some big financial beasts out there. Universities themselves are big financial beasts, but not the biggest financial beast on the block anymore. I mean, the entire tuition revenue for US higher education, $1 trillion plus or minus, is about 1.5 of the top tech companies in the US. So, you know, we need to have good ideas and people with good ideas. And I think if you look at most innovation in higher education, looking across the research spectrum, it is obviously, if you've got some equipment requirements, in need of money, but pretty much it's the courage of having good ideas and executing those good ideas. And I could give millions of examples of that within the field of higher education itself. So there are excellent people in Australia. We have really forward-looking thinkers in higher education and bringing those conversations together. And that's what Angel and I have started to do already, including with many others, of course.
Angel, anything to add on that?
Oh, no, as we were discussing, basically this is, you know, an ongoing conversation, and we need to bring more people along the journey in general, and to start having, you know, more open conversations and trying to start taking some action. And I think it's often a question of leading by example that we need to be going forward.
Big ideas, gents. Well, let's come back. Hopefully we'll come back and talk in 6 months, and hopefully before that on progress. Hamish Copes, Calderon, thank you very much for your time. I hope we talk again. I hope we talk again soon. And we're out.
Look forward to it.